everybody. Welcome back. I am Sheena with Krav Maga Salem and the Art of Badass. I am joined by Badass himself, Eli Knight. If you don't know him and you train in any martial art, well, you're missing out. I would highly recommend you check out his YouTube channel. I guarantee you the second you see his face, you know exactly who he is. He's been around for a long time. Very great instructor, very knowledgeable, and we are so excited to have him here today. Eli, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So let's dive right in. I've got a great question for you. Most of the time, I know you get kind of asked about, where you got started and how that all came to be. I know that you've trained in all sorts of martial arts, starting off with Taekwondo, maybe a little Jeet Kune Do, FMA. You train currently in Muay Thai and everything else. But why is it that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu holds such a special place in your heart?
I think that it was, I started with jiu-jitsu like a long time ago, but it wasn't the Brazilian paradigm of things. So it was a little bit more, it's easier just to call it Japanese jiu-jitsu. And I personally feel like all jiu-jitsu is Japanese, but that's a whole nother story. It had kind of a Filipino flair to it when I started. So it was a natural gateway to Filipino martial arts and things like that too. But I think that the grappling nature of it, it just felt more natural to me. And I don't know why, because I was always really weak and scrawny and everything. But I think, partly like the ground part of it, the ground grappling part of it, there's really a nice kind of neutralizing effect. So when you start to understand those positions and you start to see how some of the transitions and submissions and things like that work, they really neutralize a lot of the strength and size and explosiveness of the other person. And so for me, not really ever being very athletic or very strong or very anything, that was very helpful. So, feeling like I could actually defend myself and control someone in that kind of like high intensity environment was really, I guess, empowering, so it was a really cool feeling to me. The maxim with martial arts is always like it gives the smaller, weaker person, the ability to defend themselves against somebody bigger. It's based on leverage and using the opponent's like attack against them, their strength against them, their attributes against them. That's the cliche, But for me, jiu-jitsu, my exposure to jiu-jitsu like delivered on that more than anything else. I think that striking, I always like striking. I always like the striking arts, boxing and Taekwondo and Muay Thai. And but for me, it required a lot more athleticism and a lot more processing of information and a route that I always wasn't as good at. So I guess that's it though. There's something about it.
Yeah, wonderful. Can you talk a little bit more about stalking Royce Gracie around in the early days and how you became a flagship affiliate?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. We started out, like I said, we were already doing jiu-jitsu, but jiu-jitsu is very different from whenever the Gracies came on the scene, especially in the United States. So, and the whole like Brazilian explosion, So after the UFC, and we saw, this guy was doing jiu-jitsu, the martial art we were supposedly doing. We were like, well, that's a lot different than our jiu-jitsu, So we need to kind of take note of how the Gracie family is doing things differently. And but luckily, they had just started really doing seminars like more popularly because of the popularity of the UFC. So we were centralized. We're in Kentucky, so we're not on the coasts. They were mostly either in like East Coast or West Coast. So. But it was fortunate though, because they would come and do seminars in the Midwest, and they would do things in like St. Louis and Memphis and Lexington and some other locations. So we would go and go to these seminars, and we started to make these long road trips, go to like camps and stuff. And eventually we started, like Hoy started noticing us showing up time and time again. Like that's something that's really amazing about that family. It's something about that, especially that side of the family. In the old days, and even now, you'll go to seminars with like Henner and Huron and those guys, and they'll remember everyone in the seminar's name, like pretty soon into it. Like you were talking rooms of 80 people they've never seen before, and they're like learning every single person's name, and they'll be able to like go back and recite it. Like it's nuts. So that interpersonal kind of communication that they had, and that learning about every single person in the room and personalizing it was really, it's really attractive, and their teaching was very attractive, on top of, obviously, they had an extremely powerful martial art that they were, giving you the information about. So anyway, he started to notice us, and eventually asked us if we wanted to join the network, wanted to join the association. And so because there was always like 5 to 8 of us that went all the time, and there wasn't much more than that, just training, period. Like with our group back then, it was back when we were in this small little town. So we would go and we would learn, whatever they were showing at the seminar. We would come back, train it for weeks or months at a time, and then go and find another seminar and hit it up like that. And that was basically how we had to do it, because there was no YouTube, there was no instructional videos out. There was,
this is early 90s, right?
Yeah, it's like by this time mid 90s, but still, I mean, the internet's still in its like infancy basically by that time. And so you didn't have the access to information like you do now, which is amazing. It's like the parent story, like, you don't know how good you got it these days, kids. That's how I feel when I'm telling people in classes sometimes. It's like, man, you guys have it so good. You can look up your favorite instructor, and they're almost guaranteed to have some kind of instructional series out, whether it's good or not. I mean, you can find something on anybody.
Excellent. So you've expressed your love about the totality of the art of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, meaning that it's not just sport or tournament, but the origins of it being self-defense. Can you talk a little bit more about that as a whole, and kind of your philosophy on it?
Yeah, it's I think that the separation, especially the argumentative separation between the sportive aspect and the self-defense aspect of jiu-jitsu is really more of a modern thing. And I think that a lot of that is probably because of the popularity and proliferation of the sport. When back in the old days, like, I'm that old, but there was no distinction. I mean, it was like we would learn something, and it was a jiu-jitsu technique. It's like our like Hoist would teach us something, and we didn't really contextualize it. I mean, mostly because we had seen him walk in wearing a gi and fighting like in no holds barred, like, cage fights back then. And so it's like, whatever he said, I mean, he's beating everybody pretty formulaic, pretty systematically. So we're just going to listen to whatever he's saying and just go with it.
Yeah.
But the sport has eclipsed the self-defense aspect for sure, and as far as jiu-jitsu goes. And most of the time now, when you say BJJ, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, that's what people think. They think about the sport. They don't think about Jiu-Jitsu as a martial art, for the most part. And then you have the different distinctions of it, because you can separate it into gi, into no gi, sportive. You can separate it into MMA, which is still an extension of the sport, but it's a lot more reality based. And then you can go fully reality based, which is the self-defense aspect of it. And that was ultimately the initial intention. But I mean, we're talking about all the different transitions it had to go through over the years, so it didn't develop into, I mean, like the old days, feudal Japan era times. It was, it was a battlefield martial art, so, but once all that disbanded and once all that went away, it's like, it was kind of, wasn't really practiced the same way. It wasn't a military thing any longer, And even if you think about it back then, it's like, you think about the hand-to-hand combat applications of jiu-jitsu, what it was. It's kind of like, if you're in the military, how much time do you really spend on hand-to-hand combat? I mean, you have all these other weapon systems, you have all these other skills to learn, you have all these other aspects of military. And so jiu-jitsu was a portion of that. But, you also had learning how to use your sword, learning how to use your bow, learning how to, learning horseback, learning all this different stuff. So, but, because it was preserved in different forms, and one of the most important is judo, and judo is really what preserved jiu-jitsu more than anything. And so if you look at what the Gracie family was doing, it was, could arguably be said mostly judo back then. Now, it looks different than Olympic style judo today, because again, judo is another one of those things that's gotten very sportive. It's a powerful art. It's got a lot of application, but it's got a lot of conventions of sport surrounding it as far as rule-based systems. And that's the same thing what happening to jiu-jitsu now, but which is not bad. I mean, as long as there's understanding about it, and as long as there's clarity behind the person teaching it, You know, if it's sport, that's fine, but call it sport. You know, don't try to act like this is the totality of the art. You know, so.
Well, and I think you have a really unique perspective on that. For somebody who's maybe looking to seek out a school or a place to train for self-defense, for sport, you know, what would be the differences you would ask them to look for depending on what their goals are? What would you suggest to look for?
I don't. It's tough because like I know about how a lot of other schools train. I know, you know, I go and visit other places and I kind of see how they train, kind of see the curriculum they follow, kind of see what their goals are. I think though that mainly it boils down to the instructor. This is the hard part that it's difficult for me because I don't walk into when I go visit places, typically it's either go teach there as like a seminar or I go there to just train myself with like people like in a group, not in take a class, you know. So I don't see how the instructors convey the information a lot of the time. So I think a lot of times whenever it's not clearly distinguished that, you know, we're going to be learning an armbar today. Now there's ways you're going to pull off an armbar in a self-defense situation that are going to be extremely similar to how you're going to do it in a tournament. There's going to be a lot of overlap between the techniques, but there are definitely considerations, and this is where it gets a little contentious between the hardcore self-defense people, the hardcore sport people, about how deeply those distinctions run and how deeply the considerations that you have to make for a self-defense application of a technique really truly run. Because there's a lot of things that can happen, and it's not just like, okay, well, let's make sure he can't punch me in the face while I'm doing it. Now it's a street move, you know, and you know that's obviously a big consideration. But there's a lot of things. There's you know, I don't know any jiu-jitsu school off the top of my head, and this could probably get me crucified out there somewhere, but like that's really doing any scenario-based training, which is important. You know, I mean, I'll admit that that's my absolute weakest area. But I think I definitely see the extreme importance behind scenario-based training. And there's not a lot of schools, even the ones that do teach self-defense, that go very deep with anything weapons related, you know. And, you know, we could have a discussion about how deeply you really need to go into like unarmed self-defense against weapons anyway. I mean, but it gets very lightly touched on. You know, it's almost like, well, kind of like when you're taking some classes in college, it's like, you just got to get this one out of the way. You know, it's like, you got to have it for your degree. Just go ahead and get it. You're never going to use it, but you got to have it because it's in the canon and whatever, you know? So I think a lot of places throw the self-defense in kind of that way. It's like one of your, what do they call them? Not electives, but your like core, you know, that when you're first starting out, like your associate's degree, you have to get these fundamental things out of the way.
Absolutely.
But I think though, like, because whenever I'm teaching, I like to try to make considerations. Like if it's not only if it's not obvious, if this is going to be a more self-defense environment technique that we're doing or way that we're doing it. But, you know, or if it's more sportive, I like to make those considerations. And it's tough because like the longer you teach, the more assumptions you tend to make. You know, you start to make more assumptions like, this is so basic, I don't have to mention that. You know, I don't have to talk about this. Everybody should already know this. But it's crazy because like beginners, like you shouldn't make too many assumptions with beginners a lot of the time, because beginners can really have some just no awareness of, you know, maybe you shouldn't do this kind of particular sweep in a street fight, you know, because you could maybe get stomped in the head if you do it. You know, maybe this is not the best takedown because, you know, if you're on concrete, it's not going to go down like that. You know, you're going to both get hurt. So it's just things like that. And I don't have to draw it out really detailed, but it is nice to make a mention of it. That's a very long-winded way to answer the question I just like thought about you asking just now. But I think that would be the thing. I think, you know, going in, visiting a class, asking how much emphasis they put on self-defense or on MMA or on strictly sportive tournament style grappling. And then also once you take those like trial classes, seeing if what they said they do really matches up to what they are doing in the class. But that's tough, man. It's a tough thing because you're asking a beginner with little to no understanding or awareness of any of this to be, you know, discerning and critical about the criteria that they're measuring up against for this class. But I don't know, it's a tough one. It's for sure a tough one.
Yeah, and I think it's hard, especially for newcomers. Sometimes they see the flashy, belts and medals and certificates hanging on walls, and they see everybody in, a gi or whatever it might be, a uniform or whatever, and it's just appealing in general. So, I mean, I think it's really hard for our beginners to figure out, what's flash and what's pizzazz and what's legitimate, because again, they're really coming from nothing, no education. So it's easy to get sucked into what looks cool versus having some education and some background as to actually what works. So kind of quick segue, we hit on it just a little bit. Bladed Grappler, fantastic series, both 1 and 2. I can say I'm somebody who purchased both series and watched it, enjoyed it. Can you tell us a little bit about where the motivation and inspiration came to do those series?
Yes, it wasn't my idea. So but it was, I'll tell you what turned me on to the idea, because the way the idea was pitched to me was what would it look like to, take ground grappling from a jiu-jitsu perspective and like add a knife to it, And so the way I interpreted that is, because I always think of things more from like a self-defense aspect, and it was, well, okay, so how do we end up on the ground with a knife, and there's plenty of times that the knife comes out in the midst of the fray. It's not always pulled out, presented, and then the fight ensues, because that's when you should be running by that time, so it was more along the lines of that. So that was how I interpreted it, because I'm not going to, the way that I feel like it was honestly originally intended when it was pitched to me was, me as the person with the knife using jiu-jitsu, and it's like, so I don't want to teach people just how to be better murderers. And so I mean, that's not like what I'm about. I'm not trying to do Assassin's Creed over here. So it was like, so I kind of repitched it back, and I was like, this is what I feel comfortable talking about, and I think we could really make something that's not really out on the market. I mean, it's because a lot of people don't focus too much, and this is something that we've done with the guys that I train with, because it is more self-defense based. We have talked about things like that. We do talk about weapons and guns and knives and sticks and everything else, and in all ranges of the fight. And so basically the premise that I took it from is, what if through, the way I say it is, through lack of intention or lack of ability, this person had a weapon and they didn't pull it until they're in this section of the fight, and this section being the ground grappling section, which is common to see in street fights, I guess, for lack of a better word. So the first volume was all about, okay, well, how do I protect myself, keep the pointy end out of me, and sustain the least amount of damage possible to be able to eventually try to create space and get out of the situation. So the second volume is like, well, where do we take it now? We kind of addressed a lot of that in the first volume as just a continuation of the same thing, but I wanted to do with the second volume, take it more along the lines of, well, what if it's not just one-on-one? What if it's not just me and I'm defending myself against this person with a knife, but there's a third party involved, not like a secondary attacker. I'm not trying to say multiple attackers, but something that what if I can't just cut and run because I have a kid with me, I have my spouse with me, I have someone I'm charged to protect. Maybe I'm a police officer or personal security or something, that I can't just like jump up and get myself out of it because they're left behind with this person with the weapon. So that's why the second volume concentrates a little bit more on taking things through fully to subduing this person, to trying to control this person, and in some cases to try to disarm the person. So yeah, that's kind of where that came from and where it wound up.
Yeah, and as somebody who's actually been attacked multiple times by people with edged weapons, edged weapons can be anywhere from, we commonly think knives, right? But I've seen people attacked by pencils. I've had people come at me with shards of glass. I mean, an edged weapon can be any number of different things. So, when you talk about being somebody who has to protect somebody else or keep another population safe and be that person in between the person with that edged weapon, it's a whole different ball game than just cutting and running like you're talking about. And there are times where we aren't armed, or we don't have the opportunity to see it in advance. And so I know that style of training, and I point to it pretty frequently, when I'm talking to my private security officers, my law enforcement officers, and even more, you might be surprised, well, you probably won't be surprised, but I talk a lot with my folks who are in that vicinity of domestic violence, because sometimes, you know, we see what happens is that attacker or that known person gets in as close as possible before attacking while trying to conceal that tool. So, I mean, those are kind of some of the populations that I highlight your training on, and I say, here's some great tools and some great options, you know. And on that note, we actually have an instructor at our school who's a Gracie law enforcement instructor, and, you know, he talks all the time about, you know, you might be the best boxer in the world, but you go to your back, you better know how to use all of your tools from your back. This is a different situation. And as far as law enforcement or even private security goes, a good portion of those fights end on the ground. So it's so important, you know, to be proficient with all your tools. Often you've heard it, you know, oh, just shoot them in the head, or just do that, or just do that. But unless you're training these skills, especially as a law enforcement officer, I mean, yes, you have this certain use of force that you can use, but ultimately your job is to take that individual into custody if possible. Can you talk a little bit more about just training with law enforcement and kind of how your mindset will shift from, you know, just training your everyday Joe who's there to just learn some skill to these people who are literally using this each and every day as they detain people and put people in custody?
Yeah, I definitely, and that's some of my favorite training is with law enforcement, particularly because and everything from like correctional officers up through like SWAT, you know, I mean, and anywhere in between. I've done some work with like federal officers and things along that nature too, but I learned so much from training with them, you know, because they provide context that I didn't consider because they've had these experiences. You know, I remember we were doing an edge weapons course. This was several years back. And I remember one of the officers like because we were talking about the tooler drill, the 21-foot thing and all that, right? And we're talking about the issues with it and whatever. And it's always very eye-opening to cops whenever you bring that up if they've never heard of it, which it seems like everybody's heard of it by now, but like, you know, it's something
we'll call
to
it forgotten information.
Right. Yeah, exactly. But, you know, I mean, you know, think about, you know, new cops though. I mean, you know, like people who are, you know, didn't have any experience in these kind of areas before, and maybe weren't even like around guns at all, or any kind of violence, you know, because that's the common complaint I hear from my cop friends these days. It's like, man, these like recruits, it's like we just keep getting, they're so soft. They're so soft. They're so like, I don't feel comfortable. Like, I'm going to beat the shit out of these guys before they leave the academy because I don't feel comfortable with as soft as they are going through this. And which, you know, that's information I wouldn't be privy to if I didn't have a lot of, you know, police officer friends and everything. But anyway, the context they are able to provide for me is always really interesting. And using the thing about the 21-foot rule that I mentioned just a second ago, 21-foot principle, we'll call it. But it's one of the cops made the statement after we did this, and we drilled it a couple of times just to illustrate it and to show the people in the course. And you know, one of the cops was like, "Man, I don't know that I've ever gone into a residence, you know, that I've ever even made an arrest where I had 21 feet between me and the person, unless I was chasing them. You know, if you have 21 feet, like that, because I'm walking into like mobile homes, I'm walking into small cramped houses, I'm like looking in a closet, I'm chasing somebody in a backyard or something. So that, you know, things like that are really cool. When I was trying to teach some just mobility drills and some things like bridging and shrimping and stuff, and then the first time that I was doing those drills in a group with there's a lot of tactical cops, and their body armor was so it was so obstructive, and constrictive, you know, that I had to really like look at, man, okay, I'm gonna have to modify this a little bit. I'm gonna really have to consider that, you know, and not only that, but I mean, the size of people varies so much too. You know, this like 300-pound cop over here and then this 140-pound cop over here are both going to be restricted in other ways about, you know, that same kind of gear and everything. So yeah, it's really interesting for me to learn from them so much in a lot of those ways. But I enjoy that kind of work too. And it also, you know, it educates me. I've been educated a lot on what they're allowed to carry, you know, because like a lot of policies as far as like backup weapons are able to carry. Can they carry a knife? You know, is their knife that they carry can only be for utility? You know, can you carry a punch knife? Can you carry, you know, a full, you know, whatever kind of size or length or whatever? So I've done several courses now on duty knife as a backup weapon, and or tactical knife use for the name changes all the time. But but that's a really interesting course too, because a big aspect of that is about weapons retention, and it's about weapons retention and also regaining control of your weapon if your weapon's been compromised or if the other person has hands on your weapon. So and then also once you regain getting that weapon back under your control, then how do you use it most effectively, as far as like the proximity of you and the other person. And this is something I mentioned on a talk I was doing the other day about something that really resonates, because it was just a simple verbiage behind it, but it was, if you're going to carry a gun, you better know jujitsu. And I think that you better know some kind of grappling art, because if you're carrying that gun, whether this is like personal protection, concealed carry, if you're law enforcement, whatever it is, once the weapon comes out, that weapon has a specific purpose why it comes out, that it's supposed to serve. And if it doesn't serve that purpose effectively, now it's potentially a liability. And when you have 4 hands on the gun versus 2, then it's that's a whole different ballgame. And it doesn't matter like how good of a shot you are at that point. It matters how good of control and how good of understanding of that grappling environment, that enhanced or grappling environment now has become. So but I absolutely love, and I'm very fortunate to get to have several cop friends. I've got 2 really close friends. One's a city cop and one is a state trooper, and just excellent guys, and always are able to provide me with such great information over the years. I've trained with both these guys for like 15 to 20 years. So
yeah,
it's really
absolutely.
cool.
And you highlighted it just a second ago talking with firearms, and I think it's important to mention, so many people, and I know you've experienced this, so many people think because they carry a firearm they're good, they don't need any kind of self-defense, they don't, whatever. And it's so wrong. There's that mindset is just absolutely, you're the type of person who shouldn't carry a firearm. If you cannot go further than getting your concealed carry, stop carrying, because you don't know what you're doing.
Yes.
I mean, I know I'm going to catch heat for that. I don't really care. I truly believe that. And I think you probably will be able to share with everybody. The second somebody who owns a firearm, and that's been what they've carried for self-defense, hits the mat and start rolling with somebody just a little bit, it all goes out the window.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And it just do, like, I would suggest to anybody, and I think it should be a prerequisite. I mean, I know that it's our right to carry a gun, right? And the courses that you have to take, hell, you don't even have to have a concealed carry permit here in Kentucky longer. I mean, you can just carry. And there's a lot of states that are like that. But I mean, I think that if you're going to actively conceal carry, like, you should have to pass, some, I think, fairly extensive courses, because it's a liability. I mean, everything from the idea that when you have a hammer, then everything starts looking like a nail. I mean, that's a really, when it comes to carrying a firearm, that's a very true statement. And the other aspect of it too is, just like we were talking about, is I think people should have to do close quarters training. I think they should have to get into that kind of close quarters training. And there's some really good courses that you can go and do, where you use scenarios, you use simunition rounds, you use all kinds of different training devices and blue guns and whatever else you have. But just to think about, because even if you're using a rubber or plastic gun and you're putting that into a grappling environment, that's extremely nerve-wracking. Like, the stress has already been elevated to another factor. And this is something in your heart that can't shoot you. It's just the idea, the visualization of it. But I think that's absolutely, it's a privilege to get to carry a weapon. It's beyond a right, it's a privilege. And it shouldn't be a contentious statement to say that you don't deserve to carry a gun if you don't train with it. Like, that's like, you'll get heat if you say that. If you post that right now on Facebook or tweet that out, you don't deserve to carry a gun if you don't train with it beyond just going to the range. Like, man, people will go off on you. Like, people will go crazy on you. And it's really the mildest statement that I think that you can make.
When I do get that flack, I just say, hey, tell you what, come train with me, and let's try it. Let me show you what I mean. Let's give it a shot, right? Before you tell me how I'm wrong, let me show you why I think this, right? And so I encourage people to come down and give it a shot, because, I mean, you've experienced it. I know some of the folks you've worked with firearms wise, and it's eye-opening. And, you know, like I said earlier, I'm sure you've seen those people who, well, this is my go-to self-defense move, and then they get on a mat where, you know, and it just doesn't happen the way they think it's going to happen. And I truly believe, and I can almost guarantee you're going to back me up here, but I think a lot of people have been raised with their family members, you know, fathers, grandfathers who showed them how to shoot, and that's kind of their segue into maybe manhood or adulthood, and now you can protect your family, and everything's kind of tied back to that one tool. And so when you start going, you don't know how to use it right, you're really digging in a little more psychologically into their manhood and their ability to protect their families. And when you come right down to it, it comes back to fear. And especially this, with what's going on around us right now, I think people are already so fearful of being able to protect their family. And now you tell them, hey, you don't know what you're doing, you're going to get pushback, right? But if you listeners out there, if you're having a hard time with what we're saying right now, if this is really rubbing you in the wrong way, do yourself a favor and seek out a reputable instructor. If you need some, let me know. I will send you a whole handful probably in your area, because it's most important to folks like us who teach people how to be safer and truly in self-defense situations, to keep you as safe as possible. Eli, am I right?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, I mean, obviously, I'm gonna be a big cheerleader for that. I think that it's, if you, and it should never stop you. I mean, that's the thing. You should, obviously, if you're thinking about, if you're considering carrying, or if you're already carrying, but you're like, you know, really have a real gut check for yourself and think, you know, put yourself in scenarios, think about what you do in this situation, and then realize that you're probably wrong. No, it's not going to go down like that. And if you think, you know, you've got it all figured out, that's probably when you're the most wrong, and you should probably run to a course, run to a class, run to a training environment where they work on these kind of things, because it's absolutely crucial, and it's a huge privilege that you don't need to take for granted, to be able to carry a firearm. And it's very eye-opening. It's eye-opening from a lot of different perspectives. Usually if I go to any course like that, then I uh, I, I don't like doing them. I feel great after it. It's a lot like working out. It's like I feel great afterward. I feel great about having done it, and the knowledge I gained and the work that I did, and the skills that I built. But they are uncomfortable. They're designed to be uncomfortable, and they're uncomfortable from, well, for me, like almost every aspect. You know, I mean, I do better in the extreme close range of things. You know, the extreme close quarter stuff, I feel a little more comfortable, which is extremely stressful for most of the people who are not familiar with that range of things. But you know, you get me on the range in some of these courses, and like I'm just a big ball of stress. Like I'm the worst shot in the world. Like I'm completely a horrible marksman. And so like when I'm get to that area of it, that's my most stressful part. No, second most, because the scenario work is, man,
It's hard.
that stuff is, it's hard. It is fear and stress inducing. It is,
Yes.
it makes you feel, because I mean, for you, I haven't seen anybody like go through any kind of scenario work and get done with it and be like, yep, nailed that. You know, it's like, everybody, oh God, that was a stupid thing that I did right there. Even if it's like minuscule or whether it's huge, you know, if you shot somebody that was coming up to ask to use your phone, you know, it's like, and that happens plenty. Is when you look at a lot of these firearms courses where you're using some munitions, you're using like, you know, whatever kind of, you know, not obviously not real rounds in these scenarios, and you know you have that gun on you, and you know you're playing a scenario where things are supposed to be stressful, and that this could ultimately lead to you having to shoot this person. Just knowing those factors will already kind of set you up to be a little bit trigger happy a lot of the time, you know? So that, you know, if this person turns into, you know, they started out as just a friendly approacher, and now they're asking for your money, you know, and now they're getting a little like heated, you know, those things are, they should be extremely eye-opening to anybody that goes through those.
Absolutely.
And everybody should, you know.
Yes. I agree. I highly agree. And the other aspect that I think gets lost, and we've got some really good instructors throughout the US who highlight this really well, is we always think about the situation and then maybe we make the 911 call, but then we kind of
Right.
fall off the face of the planet like nothing else happens after that. And that's just
Yeah.
not the case. I mean, there's this whole thing, I love to tell people, there's this whole thing called litigation that then can sometimes happen afterwards. And if you don't know what that is, you're in trouble, right? Because you're just putting yourself into this very vulnerable position. I actually had Andrew Bronca on not too long ago to kind of discuss what that looks like, and I think that's an element of an element that people forget to cover when they're talking about self-defense and what that looks like. Whether
Oh,
it's firearms, whether that's hand-to-hand, whether that's an edged weapon, it doesn't matter. There's that whole element that goes with it.
yeah, that's absolutely correct, and that's a part that I don't even get to talk about very much because it just doesn't even come up in conversation whenever I'm talking to somebody who's bringing the subjects up. But that's great that you bring that up, though. One of my closest friends, he's a criminal defense attorney, and we talk about that a lot. And he's a huge gun nut, like, so he teaches me all kinds of stuff about guns that I don't know about. And he does a lot of, he's a brown belt in jiu-jitsu, and he does a lot, he's done a lot of training with firearms, and so he's a great resource for me to have because one of his biggest interests is obviously criminal defense, and it's obviously, like, violent encounters and things involving firearms. He just sent me an article the other day about it's a statute in Kentucky that and it was about chokes, and it was about how a choke is going to heartbreaking as a jiu-jitsu person. We want to choke everybody out, and to us it's like the ultimate most humane way to end a fight. And here it is that you can catch a worse charge using that in a fight than if you just knocked them out or bludgeoned them or broke their arm or something.
Yeah, and sometimes, especially when we're talking about self-defense situations, it's so important to know those laws and be aware of what tools you really can and cannot use, and to have that mindset when you're going into training. And if you can make those differentiations in your training, this is for these situations, this is not for these situations. I think you're better off knowing that in advance, and I think it's there's a lot to be said for an instructor who can differentiate those and why.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also really important too, I think, in training a lot of the time, because I think that most people out there will do. I think most people who train martial arts are going to do like 95% of their training is just going to be like, this is a technique and we're going to drill it. We're going to drill this arm drag. We're going to drill this choke, this arm lock, this sweep, this escape, this whatever. And they just drill it. And sometimes you drill it in a sequence. And which is great because it's going to build really good like muscle memory. You're going to get really conditioned to responding a certain way. And so whenever that comes up organically, you're going to snap right to it and do it. Now, the problem though is a lot of the time, muscle memory can cut both ways, right? I mean, you can build bad habits deep into muscle memory too, and so and not like just not necessarily technically or technically flawed, but maybe tactically flawed. So one of the escapes, let me use for a concrete example, one of the escapes that we've trained forever is a headlock on the ground. You reverse the position through mechanics, you get on top, you frame to get out of the headlock, you escape it, and the way that you escape the headlock, the way you frame and you get yourself out of this position, the arm is just left right there perfectly for the taking, just like to step right back over and catch this arm lock. And it works out beautifully. It works out perfectly. Now, the problem is this, though. So we're talking about a self-defense situation. And, so the thing I bring up whenever I'm showing this, because I don't show that any longer. I don't show reverse a position, frame, escape, get out of the headlock, go for the arm bar. Because let's say that you actually have to use this in a self-defense situation, and you get all the way there, you get all the way to the execution of this arm lock. So now you're in position, you got this arm, and what are you used to have happen in training when you do that arm lock? You're used to the person tapping, and then it's like, oh, okay, cool, got it. And then you stop, right? Most people aren't psychologically conditioned to take that to like full fruition and snap that arm, right? And there's probably, it's possible, but I like it that you're going to use that as a negotiation tactic and sit there and be like, hey, calm down, buddy, you know, stop fighting now. It may happen. It may absolutely happen. I've seen that happen, but
Absolutely.
it's less likely. And you have to be willing. You know, pulling a submission in a fight to me is equivalent to pulling a weapon on somebody. And if you pull a weapon on somebody, the prerequisite for that, before you pull that weapon, is you have to have the ability and intent to use that weapon. You don't pull a gun on someone unless you have that ability to shoot that person. It's irresponsible to do that. If you just pull it out for an empty threat, you know, not to say that it won't end just the threat, or you won't calm someone down, or you won't, you know, disarm someone or de-escalate the situation. But if you pull a gun on someone, you have to realize that, you know, you have to be able to shoot that person if it calls for that. So if you pull an arm lock on somebody, you have to be willing to snap that arm. You know, if you throw a leg lock on somebody, throw a foot lock on somebody, you have to be willing to snap that thing if it's a self-defense situation. And that's something that you can really build some training. Scars might be a harsh term, but you have to at least be able to contextualize that and realize that that's going to be a distinction between a self-defense situation and a competitive environment.
Absolutely. And even more so, the ability to continue the fight even after you've snapped that arm, right? Having had to fight people with broken clavicles, swinging their arms at you, fighting people shot multiple times, they'll still keep fighting, especially if they're intoxicated, if they're high on something. I mean, just because you broke their arm doesn't mean they're done. So, you know, continuing that fight may be a possibility. And so it's important to ingrain that. And like you said, you know, train with the right context. So I think that's a brilliant example. I'm gonna kind of take a 180 here, like completely flip the switch. And, you know, we've been talking about some serious topics. I did a little deep dive on your Instagram. And I had to.
This is like hot ones all of a sudden.
Know, right? I
just had wings too. This would have been perfect. I should have brought the wings on.
Next time, dang it. But I found that you really seem to have a fun love and interest in submitting figurines and statues.
Oh yes, yeah. Anytime I get the chance to, for sure. No, there was a. You know, I mean, it's been something that people have been doing for forever, you know, but like there's a whole Instagram account. There's probably more than one, but I know one is statue submissions. And I remember finding it and I was like, yes, this is the most fun thing ever. There's not a lot of great ones around here locally, but I get to travel a lot. So anytime I go to a town, especially if I'm going to have some time like out and about, you know, which is usually if like Anya and I are going to go somewhere, then you know, I'm usually like looking around at like different things and seeing if there's like statues locally there. So yeah, it's pretty fun. I've caught some interesting statue poses that are just perfect for them. You know, like the one in Salem when me and my buddy Jared were up filming with BJJ Fanatics, and they're located just outside of Boston, and so we were staying there, and we actually went down to Salem. And we're hanging out and just kind of exploring the city. And yeah, we found like perfect statue for that. So we did a couple of things on there. But yeah, it's a lot of fun though.
And on that kind of same note, you know, I reached out and talked to a lot of your colleagues, and all of them are very quick to tease you and talk about how pretty you are and how great your hair is and all that fun stuff. Right. But each one of them is super quick to follow up with how big of a heart and how genuinely a nice guy you are. Can you speak to why you find it so easy to give as much as you do to the combat sport and martial arts world, despite the fact you have great hair and you're pretty?
It would be easier to talk about my hair. I just cut my hair yesterday. I had the quarantine hair getting too out of control.
Did you do it yourself?
Yeah, for sure. I cut my hair and I shaved it and everything, and looked like I went into witness protection all of a sudden. So yeah, I don't know. I think I've got like one thing that I'm like pretty good at, and it's like martial arts related, specifically jiu-jitsu stuff. And so, and I just like teaching, you know. I mean, it's not like a real selfless, like benevolent thing. I mean, I like to help people for sure. But you know, I like, I think if you have something that you found, whether it was some kind of artistic pursuit or some kind of skill or whatever, and you were fortunate enough to find this thing in your life that most people don't, you know, and won't, you know, and it was transformative, and it was something that really, it fixed things in you. It enhanced things in you. It brought out potential in you that you didn't know you had, you know. And for me, like jiu-jitsu was all that. So I think that you feel compelled if you have something like that to share it. And ultimately, the best way to share it is if it's a teachable skill or it's a teachable thing, then it's to teach it. And so that's I never really thought that never thought I would be like 10 or 15 years ago. I never thought I would be like doing this to the degree that I am now. I didn't know it was possible. So I always thought that I was going to have like some kind of like normie job to be able to support my martial arts addiction, like most people do, which is perfectly fine. Sometimes those people appreciate it even more than us full timers because it can become work sometimes.
Yeah.
But it was I think that's the thing. I mean, if you look around, you have so many ways to share now that just have never existed before in history. I mean, where are you right now? You're in California, right?
Oregon.
You're in Oregon? Okay, I knew it was over there somewhere. So and
we're
I'm
all
in
basically
Kentucky,
one big state out here.
Yeah. So, but yeah, it's like I can talk to somebody just like this in Mexico, in Australia, and I did a conversation. I've got a conversation next week with the same guy, but he's over in London. We talk all the time and we do like FaceTime chats. We're talking about collaborating on a Zoom seminar for people that are somewhere else. And like, so he's in London, I'm in Kentucky, and so it's crazy. If you don't take advantage of the things that you have right now to share with people, just like you're doing with this podcast, then what are you doing? What are you even doing if you're not sharing these things that you can share, and helping to give something back? It's like, I think if you're not like contributing, you're leading a pretty selfish existence, right? So I don't know. I don't
that's a great
like
philosophy.
Yeah. I think that it was never like, it never feels to me like I'm going out and trying to help people. It's just as much selfish as it is anything else. Like, I enjoy doing it. I get some like extreme satisfaction out of seeing that I can convey something to somebody and they can be like, oh, that's so cool. Like that's such a cool move. I never heard this broken down this way before. I never heard somebody explain it with that detail, and now it clicks with me. And you can see that kind of awaken in somebody, then that's a beautiful thing. So we have an obligation to share with people and to teach people what we can.
Those aha moments are rewarding. So you've trained with some of the most prolific and expert and amazing instructors and fighters all over the world. Can you just pick off the top of your head maybe one or two that really stand out as over delivering when they teach or when they give information or they coach?
Right. Yeah. Over delivering. The one that really pops in my head is Craig Douglas. I feel like I mention him too much now. Like I'm starting to like fanboy out too much because it seems like the last 3 different podcasts I've done he's come up, and I just brought him up already. But oh man, he's that dude's incredible. He really is. He really checks all the boxes. The thing that impressed me the most about him, and this is the over delivery part, I expected him to be knowledgeable about everything firearms related. I knew he had an extensive background in grappling and in jiu-jitsu. I knew he had an extensive martial arts background. Obviously, he was law enforcement for a long time. So he has all these different areas of expertise, but how articulate and engaging of a speaker he is. Like that's something that I was blown away by, mostly because like that's not my strong suit. Like I can articulate, but only in the way of like explaining details. I'm not engaging as like a performer, almost like an entertainer. And that's what it is. He's entertaining, not comedic necessarily, but you're hanging on his words. You're listening to what he's saying and the tone in which he's saying it, and the tone is very deliberate. And that's the thing. When you're able to use certain like intonation to keep people's attention whenever you're teaching, and you're not monotoning it, but you're also using that tone and delivery system to heighten their awareness to certain aspects of what you're teaching. Like that's a high level skill that I'm very envious of that in him. So yeah, he definitely over delivers. There's a lot of people that do. On probably the opposite end of the spectrum, I know several jiu-jitsu people that are the same way. Henner and Gracie are great examples too. Henner is just off the charts with his knowledge of jiu-jitsu, but also his enthusiasm to teach it. You know, it looks over the top a lot of the time when you see him on the video, but that's just him. You know, it's just like he's got, they call it energy, and it's just so out there, and it's so incredible that you can't help but be engaged by that guy. I mean, plus he's like 6'5", so I mean, he's just literally larger than life of a figure. And Huron is almost not the opposite, but he's a very subdued, very cerebral. And Henry can be loud and going 90 miles an hour, and everybody's like just focused on him. But if Huron speaks, then everybody kind of like quiets because they want to hear what he's going to say. You know, so the dynamic between those guys is excellent. Almost every member of the family, the Gracie family that I've ever met or trained with, they have something about them that, and it just is, this is beyond me fanboying about them, but there's something about them that is so extremely engaging, and they found their real niche in teaching, because they take teaching very seriously. And you know, I think that's one of the big things that has really popularized Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. Obviously, the effectiveness of it, and how they've proven the effectiveness of it in the areas they have. But the way they've conveyed the information is one of the real biggest things that distinguish it from a lot of other martial arts and a lot of other martial arts teachers and practitioners. So yeah, Hoist, obviously, you know, he isn't somebody who is going to rattle off a lot of details. It's going to be more about watching the precision of his technique when he's executing something. And the details he points out are always the most essential detail. You know, it may be where I would put like 50 details on something when I'm teaching it. He would maybe say 5 or 4, but those are going to be like game-changing details. You know, so yeah, it's interesting. But that's the thing too. Like I noticed a lot about people's teaching styles and the way they convey information, especially if it's successful, if it's really a good teaching style. And I tried for years to like pattern myself after this person, after that person. It's why Ryan and Amber still make fun of me to this day when I say jujitsu. A lot of the time, it's hard for me to say jujitsu, and so it just comes out jujitsu a lot of the time because I had so many Brazilian teachers. But you know, so I've patterned a lot of these things after other people so long that eventually it just like meshed into something that became my teaching style.
Yeah.
So I guess what it is just I'm a big copy off of a little bit of everybody, enough to where it's indistinguishable and it makes it look like it's unique.
Yeah, but there's a lot of people who have some similar style training, and it really took you to take all of that stuff and then take it to the places that it is today. So don't sell yourself too short. You've done a lot of really good things for the community, whether it's, you know, again, combat sports, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, martial arts in general. So I mean, you know, you've taken that information and you've launched it into places and to given it to people who wouldn't have had it, all because of the things that you've been passionate about, and you are explaining it in ways that people really enjoy. That's why you've been so popular on YouTube and social media and through all the different stuff you're doing with BJJ Fanatics. So like I said, don't sell yourself too short. There's a reason why everybody knows Eli Knight. Now, I've got just a couple more questions for you, and then I'll let you go. So I listened to another podcast you were on, and you talked a little bit about multiple attackers and weapons and kind of dealing with the keyboard warriors and the YouTube, you know, comments and the things. Well, why don't you just do that? Why don't you just do that if there's multiple attackers? And I love that you said, how about you just learn how to fight one person first? That floored me. I about died laughing because it's so true. And I love that mindset. Can you tell me a little bit about dealing with some of the YouTube commenters and the trolls and the keyboard warriors and how you do that?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I think I'm a solid like purple belt in dealing with trolls and commenters and the comment section people. But so this is something that I looking at a lot of people that I've worked with that are really involved in social media and seeing like, you know, them being in comment sections to varying levels of like contention and arguments and things like this. And, you know, you hear a lot of people will say like, you just don't engage that. Just don't, you know, just ignore it. You can't look at the comments. It's going to drive you crazy, blah, blah, blah. I think there's a really important element that gets overlooked when in something like that, and not discussed a whole lot either. And if I see somebody that I'm like, okay, this person is just they are so far removed, they're so unconscious to what they're talking about that I'm not going to change this person's mind. I'm probably not going to like really do anything or say anything that's going to like really make them rethink what they're talking about. But I know that other people are watching that. They're seeing that conversation, they're seeing that comment, and they're maybe frustrated or maybe in agreement with that person too. But so if they can watch, if I engage with that person and they can see that third party person can see that conversation take place, that might be something educational for them, and not necessarily that I'm going to, have this enlightening thing to say to anybody, but just watching the dynamic of how it's handled, I think in itself is a form of almost like conflict resolution, in that kind of sense. So, I mean, I think it can have a valuable purpose in doing that, but I think it's easy to be drawn in emotionally. There's, especially depending on what the topic is, I try to be very apolitical. I don't discuss things about politics or religion for the most part on social media. And for the most part, I try to stay pretty two-dimensional as far as just sticking to my lane and doing martial arts related stuff, doing jiu-jitsu related stuff. I try to stay out of, anything else. But it's difficult. It's difficult sometimes because people will bring that to your doorstep a lot of the time. And, I think once you really kind of give yourself some guidelines as far as what you're going to tackle and what you're not, then that's a good route to take, so.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, my last question for you, right? I'm going to get emails. You might too, right?
Okay.
Growing shots, effective or not?
For what? Yeah. So,
we'll say self-defense.
Yeah. But yeah. Okay. Got it. Obviously there's a degree of effective to it. There's a degree of effectiveness to any way you hit another person. Right. Now, but the thing with any strike is going to be, what kind of, let me think, how effective can you really realistically guarantee it's going to be? I mean, I could say you hit someone in the liver and you're going to drop them, because it happens a lot.
Yeah, it does.
you can also hit somebody and be off by, a little bit. And, you thought you hit them in the liver and it didn't have the effect that you thought it was going to have. So I think the biggest thing, groin strikes is kind of like the poster child for the overly confident assumption that something is going to be a one hit fight ender, because it's not a thing. There's not such a thing. The whole thing where you palm strike somebody and it shoves the cartilage in their nose into their brain and it kills them instantly. That's not a thing either. Gouging somebody's eyes out. Yeah. If you hit somebody in the eyes, then likely it's going to hurt really bad. You kick somebody in the balls, it's going to hurt, but like we were just talking about a second ago, crazy stuff happens in a fight. So, people get their arm broken, they get their collarbone broken, they get their jaw broken, they keep fighting. And so I think the main thing is like, yeah, if though you have anything that's the magic bullet, then you probably need to really question yourself about the problems with that, the pitfalls of that. So, and Groin Strikes is just really kind of the poster child of that. That's really the thing. There's nothing wrong with Groin Strikes unless you think it's the end all be all and it's going to stop anybody in their tracks and it's the magic bullet.
Yeah, the key is the follow-up, right?
Yeah, it's always a follow-up.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why, I mentioned the choke earlier, and it's because the choke tends to be the most guaranteed of, nothing's guaranteed, but it's one of the most guaranteed ways to incapacitate somebody because everybody falls asleep if you choke them. Now, not to say a lot of stuff can't go sideways during that choke, and that things can go wrong and your technique can be flawed and everything else. But, I think there's different degrees of reliability in a fight, in a violent encounter, and none of them need to be overestimated.
Absolutely. So can I quote you on saying it depends?
No, I think legally you can't. I'm still trying to come up with a good variation of that phrase because I say it so often, but Ryan, he invented that damn thing or whatever, but yeah. So it's already taken. So I just have to say context dictates, I guess I'll say it like that.
Awesome. Well, Eli, can you tell the people listening where to find out more about you and the things that you've got upcoming, the things that people can get a hold of to continue to train with you on?
Yeah, I think it's easiest just to say like Knight Jiu-Jitsu on all the stuff, So the biggest things I like to push are the Jiu-Jitsu deep dive with the Budo brothers that I did.
Yes.
So we pitch it as a digital seminar. It's basically a course. It's got a lot of information, but the Jiu-Jitsu deep dive. BJJ Fanatics, I've got like 3 different volumes with them, and there's what are the names of them? Let's see, Position Transition Submission. That's one of them. Gi to Street, which was the laziest name I probably have ever come up with, and then Jiu-Jitsu based self-defense solutions. So those 3. Then I got like a YouTube channel. If people don't know about that, it's Knight Jiu-Jitsu on YouTube.
Great channel.
And
great channel.
Patreon. Thank you very much. And Patreon, Knight Jiu-Jitsu. So
yes,
I think that's it. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Well, Eli, thank you so much for coming on. You have just been a pleasure and a joy to speak with. And I just really appreciate your time. Everybody else, thank you so much for listening. And please check out Eli and all the amazing things he's doing. For those of you on YouTube following below, I'm going to link all of that so you can find him. I highly suggest following him on Instagram, following him on Facebook, and everywhere on social media that you can. He's just a great guy, lots of information, and yeah, again, thank you so much for joining us today.
I appreciate you having me, Sheena. Thank you.
Awesome. Now, let's see here.